Welcome back to Equity Tutors and today's lesson on ecosystems. So I'm going to start with just an overview of what an ecosystem is, although you probably have an idea already. I just want to drill down into the actual definition of what we consider an ecosystem to be. So an ecosystem represents an intricate network where living organisms also interact with non-living organisms. So biotic and abiotic components. So this complex structure comprises of living and non-living components, and it's essentially a dynamic environment where various life forms coexist and interact with their physical surroundings. And this creates a delicate balance which is absolutely vital for their survival. And any change in that balance can change the ecosystem. So ecosystems are defined by the relationships among organisms. So we're essentially saying that no one organism exists on its own. It's always dependent on the environment around it. And this is characterized by cycles, things like nutrient cycling and also energy flow. And these relationships are exemplified in processes like photosynthesis, where plants utilize the sunlight to produce energy-rich compounds, which basically is initiating the flow of energy from the sun into a biotic domain. So from abiotic, non-living, to biotic. So we're converting sunlight, which isn't alive, into the plants to give the plants energy, which are alive. And this energy sustains the growth and function of plant life, subsequently providing a source of sustenance to animals, for animals that eat plants or herbivores. This energy transfer within ecosystem extends through different trophic levels in the food chain. So the herbivore eats the plant, which is getting energy from the sunlight, and then another animal is eating that herbivore. And as organisms consume and pass on energy, the system maintains a constant flow. Eventually, upon the demise of these organisms, so when these organisms die, they engage in decomposition, breaking down dead matter and returning nutrients to the ecosystem, maintaining the cycle. So no energy is lost. And ecosystems are governed by a multitude of factors, which we will go over today. So these are both external and internal, and as I've gone over, they are both biotic and abiotic. External factors will be things like the climate, the soil, location, and how they influence the ecosystem structure and diversity. So, for example, soil fertility, specifically the presence of necessary nutrients, which you've learned about in Lauren's lesson, is fundamental for nutrient-specific flora or specific plants growing within that soil. And so any change to that soil composition will then change the biotic factors within the ecosystem. And then internal factors such as the population of a certain species of plant or root competition play a pivotal role in the system's feedback loop. So how they compete with one another, maybe one species will start to have a growth spurt, which will then affect another living species population within that ecosystem. So the term ecosystem was coined by a man called Arthur Tainsley in 1935, and his aim was to emphasize the interdependence between organisms and the environment. And eminent ecologists at the time furthered this concept, leading to the development of ecological studies which are focused on the relationships and energy flow within food chains and nutrient cycling. And different ecosystems vary greatly in scale and complexity. So you could look at the whole ocean as an ecosystem, or you could look at your back garden as an ecosystem. So they vary greatly in scale, and the and in terms of size, but also in complexity. So something like the Amazon rainforest is probably much more complex than a forest in the UK, for example, even though they could, the same size of forest, that you could have equal size forests, but they could be much more diverse or complex from one another. And even in an individual human body, that can be considered an ecosystem because we have multiple bacterial species growing within us. And that will vary from person to person and will vary in complexity. So the number of bacteria we have present and the types of bacteria that we have present may be different from person to person as well. But then finally, the last concept to understand, so not just that everyone is connected and that every ecosystem is different, is that the ecosystems are also linked to one another. So the ecosystem of the ocean is connected to the ecosystem of the Amazon rainforest in some way. So even though there are boundaries between these ecosystems and they are their own individual environments, there are some organisms that will cross those boundaries, and so there are connections between them. And this interconnectedness amplifies the impact of external influences and emphasizes the importance of maintaining a balance within each ecosystem for overall sustainability. So think about the obvious external influence here would be climate change, and although there may not be a direct link between the ocean and a forest, they are still experiencing the same effects from changes in weather patterns. So they will both suffer in similar ways. So what are some of these factors governing ecosystems? So as I said, ecosystems are significantly influenced by a wide array of factors, so many different things, and they can be categorized as external and internal. External factors will be things like the climate, as I mentioned, and soil composition, geographical location. But what about internal factors? So things that are actually present within the ecosystem. So one really good example of an internal factor is an organism which is actually a fungus which grows on plants called saprophytes. And saprophytes are responsible for decomposing dead material. And this is a really important factor because, as I mentioned in the introduction, it's important that at the end of a life that species or organism returns the energy that it's consumed back into the ecosystem. And the way that happens is by decomposition. And so the saprophytes are responsible for decomposition of plants and then will significantly impact the nutrient cycle within this ecosystem by decomposing those plants and returning the energy back to the system. So a higher concentration of biotic components often leads to a greater number of organisms perishing. And what that means is if you have more species, more organisms, you will get more death because your population is higher, you'll get more things dying, and therefore that will increase the population of the saprophytes and enhance the nutrient cycle. So if you start to plant more flowers in your garden, ultimately you're going to get more flowers dying, and then you'll get more saprophytes which will decompose those flowers. Additionally, factors like root competition, as I alluded to in the introduction, and the presence of a specific species profoundly impacts the ecosystem's dynamics. So we can also break down these factors governing the ecosystems into biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic factors encompass all elements influencing the population within a community due to the activities of other organisms. So everything which is alive and affecting the population is considered a biotic factor. These even include things like predation, competition, both inter- and intraspecific, cooperation between organisms, so sometimes they will work together, parasitism, disease, camouflage, anything that's going to contribute to the survival of an animal within the environment. And even human influences, which I will go on to speak about at the end of the talk. So things like hunting and farming. And they all play a significant role in the shape of the population and dynamics of the interactions with an ecosystem. In contrast to this, we have abiotic factors, and these comprise the physical and chemical elements that can influence populations within a community. So there's a lot of overlap here between the internal and external factors. So they are all the same factors influencing the ecosystem. They're just different ways of categorizing these factors. So abiotic factors are going to have a lot of overlap with external factors. So abiotic factors will comprise of things like physical and chemical elements. So these can be environmental conditions, but can also include water availability, light intensity, temperature, humidity, the atmospheric composition, pH levels of the soil. And again, these interplay with the non-living elements and define the suitability of an environment for various species, which will impact the ecosystem's overall balance and biodiversity. So now that we understand all of the factors that contribute to an ecosystem, and we're going to go into more detail on some of these factors later on in the module, and also, for example, on the human aspects of things, the human impact later on this talk. Now I want to go over what is actually going into an ecosystem and coming out. So I briefly went over in the introduction that the primary external source of energy is the sunlight, and this is what we refer to as primary production. So primary production serves as the fundamental process through which plants synthesize organic matter via photosynthesis, and this is really the key first step in energy flow in an ecosystem. The primary production is pivotal as it marks the entry of energy into the biotic domain within an ecosystem. Photosynthetic organisms, particularly plants, employ inorganic minerals and convert them to organic compounds. The two significant measures of primary production include gross primary production and net primary production. You're going to have a lesson on productors next week, so I'm not going to go into this in huge detail. So primary production or photosynthesis is how we get energy into the system, but as I've mentioned, it's a cycle. We want to keep the energy within this ecosystem cycle. So when that plant dies, or when an animal who has eaten that plant has died, how do we keep the energy within the ecosystem? This is by decomposition. So it's a critical process facilitated by organisms known as saprophytes. So I explained briefly in the previous section when we were discussing biotic factors affecting the ecosystem, what saprophytes actually are. But just to go over it again, decomposition is a critical process facilitated by organisms known as saprophytes or decomposers. These include various organisms like bacteria, fungi, and also certain other plant species, and they are actively engaged in breaking down decaying organic matter. And the process of decomposition unfolds in distinct phases, each contributing to the recycling of nutrients into the ecosystem. So we do not then lose those nutrients, essentially. So the initial phase is known as leaching. This involves the soluble components of dead matter being dissolved and carried away by water. So these dissolved substances integrate into the soil, enriching it with essential nutrients. Following that, we have the breakdown phase, wherein the bacteria and other microorganisms physically disintegrate the organic matter, rendering it more accessible for further processes. And this preparation essentially leads to the final phase, which is chemical alteration or decomposition, where decomposers produce catabolic enzymes, and the enzymes break down the organic matter into simpler nutrient-rich compounds, effectively completing the decomposition process. So let me go over that one more time. So the initial phase is known as leaching. This just involves all the soluble components of the dead matter being dissolved and carried away by water. The second stage is the breakdown phase. And this is where bacteria and other microorganisms will physically break down the organic matter. And this is essentially preparing it to the final phase, which is a chemical alteration, where enzymes are actually being produced and used to break down the organic matter into nutrient-rich compounds, completing the decomposition process. And the nutrients released through decomposition are then vital as they nourish the soil and subsequently support the growth of plants and other primary producers. And this is what is known as nutrient cycling, which you have already studied or will study in the rest of this module in more specific detail relating to the carbon and nitrogen cycles. So in conclusion, through decomposition, organic matter is transformed into substances that plants can take up and utilise for their growth and development. And this process ensures the continual cycling of nutrients within the ecosystem, enriching the soil and promoting the growth of new life. So with what we've covered so far, let's look at an example of an ecosystem and look at the factors, biological, so biotic or abiotic, that are affecting that ecosystem, the external and internal factors within that ecosystem, and look at what the primary producer is, and then how things are decomposed within that ecosystem. So forest is a perfect example of an ecosystem. There's a large community of organisms or biotic factors, things like trees, birds, small and large mammals, insects and fungi. And then we also have non-living components, things like the soil, the dead leaves, water from the rain. These are also external factors, and streams, rocks and many other physical or chemical factors. And the non-living components of the ecosystem will influence the community of organisms. So, for example, the weather might change the behaviour of the birds. The weather will affect the growth of the trees and the plants. The rocks will determine whether or not an animal can live near a stream, for example. So they are all connected to one another. And then one more term I would like you to learn is niche. And this is the place where a specific species lives within that habitat. So perhaps within the forest, there are small animals that live on the rocks adjacent to a stream in the forest. So that would be that animal's niche within the ecosystem. And the role that species play within the ecosystem is its niche. So it encompasses where in the environment the organism is, and also how it gets its energy and how it interacts with other species within its physical environment. And that's how an organism fits into its ecosystem. So that's its niche. So it's not just the physical place, but also how it fits into the wider ecosystem. So how its position within the ecosystem, not just physically, where it exists, but also how it interacts with the other biotic and abiotic factors. And an example of a niche would be a beetle occupying a very specific niche within the ecosystem. So dung beetles have learned to exploit the dung of animals as a resource, and they have a characteristic behaviour of rolling the dung into bowls before transporting it into an underground burrow for storage as food. So note that the niche here, we're saying where the beetle is living, but we're also saying what does the beetle do? So the beetle is rolling up these dung balls and transporting it to an underground burrow as a storage for food. And that behaviour is then going to affect the rest of the ecosystem. So the behaviour within the ecosystem has then many knock-on effects on the environment and other organisms living in it. The burrows and tunnels that they create turns over and aerates the soil, and the buried dung releases nutrients into the soil, both of which can then benefit organisms like plants. So they're essentially delivering fertilizer to the soil so that plants can grow better within that ecosystem. And then second to that, the transportation of the dung underground by the beetles also helps keep the fly populations under control. So then if you were to consider if we eliminated dung beetles from this ecosystem, their niche completely goes. So they disappear from the dung of the animals. You then get less plant growth because they're not fertilizing the soil. And then you also get an explosion in the population of the flies within that ecosystem, which would then also have a knock-on effect. So everything is connected. So with that in mind, we also need to talk about ecosystems and population dynamics. So as I've illustrated, an ecosystem is an intricate network of biological interactions where species coexist alongside non-living elements. And this core influence forms a delicate balance within that system. And a key factor in governing population dynamics within ecosystems involve the concept of a carrying capacity. So this represents a maximum population size sustainable in a specific habitat over time. So this essentially means within a certain square footage, only X number of organisms can live there. So that ecosystem can only produce so much sustenance for a specific population. So various influences such as competition between different species and within the same species, so interspecific or intraspecific, as well as predation, will significantly impact the population sizes and dynamics within an ecosystem, but they still have this limitation of a carrying capacity. And there are numerous ways that we can assess and estimate population sizes. So different methodologies are employed. One example is quadrat sampling. So this is a technique used for slow-moving or non-motile organisms. So this involves placing random quadrats, so just a square of a known size within the habitat, and then counting the number of individuals of each species within this marked area. So for example, if you were studying beetles, you could place a quadrat over a square of the beetle's niche and physically count how many beetles you find within that square. And another example is the mark release recapture method. So this is used for more motile organisms, so ones that may be faster and that are not going to stay in the same place for you to count within a square. And this is where you might see where farmers might mark sheep or cattle, for example. So you can mark the number at the beginning, and then at a later time point you collect the animals again and check that the same number are present that you marked initially. But this will assume no deaths, births or migrations, or the impact of marking the organism itself, so that there would be no harm on that organism, to estimate the population size based on recapturing the marked individuals. And understanding the population dynamics is fundamental to comprehend the delicate balance and interplay of organisms within an ecosystem. So the final thing I'm going to talk about today, since we're talking about populations and capacities of certain ecosystems, is the effect of human activity on ecosystems. So humans have a profound impact on the stability and sustainability of ecosystems. So ecosystems provide a multitude of essential services, including provisions of resources such as timber, food, medical plants, and more for humans. However, if these go unregulated and we often indiscriminately exploit these ecosystems where we are not present to take these resources, it'll have a significant impact on that ecosystem's health and balance. So, for example, the island of Borneo, there has been a huge deforestation impact there on the population of orangutans, where we are essentially making room to grow palm trees for palm oil on the island. And then what happens is that the trees where the orangutans normally live, so their niche, are disappearing and the orangutans are completely displaced, and that means that the population of orangutans are now in decline. So that is a direct impact of humans on a specific ecosystem and specifically on a specific organism. So habitat destruction remains one of the primary threats posed by human activities. So they can arise from, for example, deforestation, as I just mentioned, or urbanization. So where we are changing certain ecosystems, it could just be farmland to build homes. All of the animals that previously lived in that farmland are then displaced, or even land use changes, so leading to a loss of biodiversity and fragmentation of ecosystems. There are more obvious examples, things like overhunting, overfishing, which is a huge problem, which can obviously decimate certain species, and not only decimate that certain species, but you disrupt the niche that they held within that ecosystem, so disrupting the food chain and causing imbalances in the population dynamics. Another example is pollution, so air, water and soil pollution heavily impacts ecosystems. Pollution can result from industrial activities, agricultural runoff and improper waste disposal. This leads to chemical imbalances, reduced water quality and ultimately to degradation of habitats. And such disruptions can cause huge effects on the health of both the flora and the fauna, leading to population decline and ultimately instability of the ecosystems. And so there are conservation efforts in effect, as I'm sure you know, and environmental organisations play a critical role in safeguarding these ecosystems. And so their initiatives focus on minimising all of the adverse impacts of human activities on natural habitats, which is a huge initiative, and essentially advocating for sustainable practices. So making sure that whatever our impact is, which is almost inevitable that we will have an impact on different ecosystems, but that those impacts are minimised through sustainable practices, and also restoring ecosystems where damage has already occurred. And there's a lot to be said in just recognising the fact that we are having an impact at all, and trying our best to maintain the delicate balance necessary for ecosystems to exist, and promoting ecosystem resilience. And these efforts strive to foster a coexistence between human needs and the preservation of natural resources. So making sure that in taking everything that we need from the earth, that we're not taking that from other animals or organisms that also require those resources. So I'm going to wrap up the lesson today on ecosystems. The big take-home message is essentially that we are all connected. So not one organism, including humans, which is the lesson very much at the end, that there's not one organism that exists without having an impact on any other organism on this earth. So we are all connected. And even though one ecosystem may not be directly connected to another ecosystem, or one organism within an ecosystem not connected to another organism within a separate ecosystem, there's also always a knock-on effect. And this knock-on effect can be biological, but can also be abiotic too. So our effect as humans is affecting the climate, which is an abiotic effect, and the climate is the biggest external factor affecting every ecosystem on the planet. So we discussed the different types of factors governing ecosystems, so biotic, abiotic, intrinsic, extrinsic, what the primary production is of all ecosystems in the form of photosynthesis and energy flow via herbivores consuming plants, and then that moving energy flow up the food chain, and ultimately the end of that food chain or energy flow in the form of decomposition, returning that energy in the form of nutrients back to the soil for the growth of new plants. And then finally went over an example of an ecosystem, a habitat, a niche, and an example in the form of dung beetles of how they, within their niche, will affect multiple other organisms within that habitat or ecosystem. So thank you so much for listening. Remember, you can access additional content on our Patreon page by searching for Equity Tutors, where we have a second 30-minute lesson every week, plus monthly bonus content. You can also find us on most social media platforms. We will keep you updated on new content, and you can find us there by searching for Equity Tutors UK. Please like, share, subscribe and comment wherever you are listening, and if you're enjoying, please leave a review. Bye!
Bye!